So I sort of coincidentally made my way around the internet tonight, um, reading various articles and blogs and watching videos, all related to the general cultural debate going on right now between theism and atheism. And the first thing I read was an article about Ken Wilber, trying to figure out where he stands in this whole debate because he's sort of a very abstract kind of theorist, and in most of his public appearances that I've seen and in his books, he tries to systematize so many points of view that the system itself becomes very abstract. And so the article was trying to gauge what his opinions of people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, what his opinions of them might be, being that, of course, Wilbur is supposed to be the head of this very spiritual movement, which is um, something different than the type of spirituality which theists seem to be fixated on. And, we might not even call it a spirituality, we might call it more of a religion. Um, and then after I read that article, which really didn't get anywhere as far as describing what Wilber's take on these atheists would be. Um, Other than that, he probably agrees with most of them, but would say they're leaving something out. What exactly they are leaving out is difficult to say. Wilber would say, well, these guys are just being reductionistic. But of course, that's such a common rebuttal of scientism, of the idea that science could replace religion, because it can provide us with all the answers we need to be fully human. Um, but after I read that article, I watched a video debate at the New York Public Library between Al Sharpton and Christopher Hitchens about Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. And, Hitchens is a very articulate and intelligent cultural critic who's very well read. And, you know, to make a long story short, he really kicked Reverend Sharpton's ass. However, that doesn't mean I'm taking a side here and saying that I am with Hitchens against Reverend Al Sharpton. I'm certainly with Hitchens when he talks about how we are in a certain planetary situation right now where there are a lot of people, radical fundamentalist Muslims, but whether it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism, it doesn't matter. They're all basically mythic religions which have a literal understanding of certain texts, which in the Bible and the Quran, equally so, are quite violent and advocate certain behaviors. The Jews coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, killed a lot of other tribes and took other tribes as slaves and were pretty repressive, violent people. Um, the Quran and Muhammad are also, warriors who fight for Allah and who are quite willing to kill in order to have Allah's name or grace be seen upon earth or whatever it may be. And so we're fighting against radical Islam in the Middle East. And it is not the people that believe that suicide bombing is somehow praising Allah or a positive religious act. It is the mullahs and the shahs and the religious leaders who are becoming fanatics. And they are driving young people who in that part of the world have no, or at least a far less possibility for a positive future. upward development into Western society, access to schooling, education, and just quality lives. It's difficult in the Middle East, and it's easy to say that it's just their fault because they're just somehow more barbarous than Westerners. But there's also a lot to be said for the argument that Westerners have been trying to colonize them and, in effect, have held them down and done a lot of destruction to their communities and bombing them for their oil, basically, since the automobile really took off in the West, since the 50s, or before that when Britain was colonizing over there. So there's a large, or there's a deep history of this cultural warfare between the West and Islam, and it's difficult to blame either side. But the situation is such that we have a secularized West, which for the most part does respect basic human rights, and then we have this other part of the world where people are still treating women like second-class citizens, and that's a problem. It's a big problem. And Hitchens is very good at pointing out how religion seems to be the prime motivating factor in this type of repression and violence. But on the other hand, Al Sharpton kept on rebutting Hitchens' claims by saying that Hitchens is saying things about people and about people's misuse of God, and he hasn't said anything about God itself, about the existence or non-existence of God, which they both agreed cannot be proven or disproven. God cannot be proven or disproven through rational argumentation. And so Sharpton just really wasn't even getting involved in the debate that Hitchens was having, which is why I can't just side totally with Hitchens and say that Sharpton was somehow wrong. Sharpton wasn't very articulate in expressing why he had the spiritual views that he did, but he mentioned Paul Tillich and the notion that God is the ground of being, that God is that which exists. We can't, just as we can't prove or disprove that God exists, we can't prove or disprove existence.